I wonder whether you can think of a time when something touched your heart which made you want to take action. Maybe donating to a disaster appeal, or maybe getting involved a bit more hands-on by helping with something like Pilgrim Heart's night shelter. Today we are drawing to the end of our series, It's God Calling. We've been exploring the different ways that God called people in the Bible. We've seen him call the fearful, the reluctant and the young. Those called to tasks that seemed beyond them or they felt unworthy of. But when they were obedient, God did amazing things. We've also heard testimonies of how God has called some of us in the past. But most importantly, we've been listening to how he may be calling us now and what our response is. Today we are looking at how God called Nehemiah. And it may not be immediately obvious how God did call Nehemiah. There was no visiting angel, no burning bush, and no audible voice from heaven mentioned. I have to say that Nehemiah is one of my favourite books and characters in the Old Testament. He hears news of the state of the city of Jerusalem. Though some of the exiles have returned, the walls are still in ruins. Those who have returned are in a very vulnerable situation with no defence. And there's an ongoing sense of all that they have lost, and also that ongoing sense of disgrace and fear. What Nehemiah hears touches him deeply. He weeps, he mourns, he fasts, and he prays. The whole situation in Jerusalem has cut Nehemiah to the heart. He spends some days in prayer, seeking God about it. And we have read the great prayer he prayed at the end of this time. But we're not going to focus on that in detail. Suffice it to say, he is praying for God's intervention. But the phrase I do want to focus on is right at the end of the prayer. He prays, "Give your servant success today by granting him favour in the presence of this man." It seems like Nehemiah has a plan and is praying specifically for God's help for that plan to succeed. And as we'll find out, he's planning to take on the task of rebuilding the walls himself. Was it God calling him? And if so, how? We don't know what went on during those days of prayer. Did God speak to Nehemiah directly? Did an angel visit? Or did he just begin to get a sense that he was to be part of the answer to his prayer? That God was calling him to do something about it? And how was he going to go about it? When God called some of the other people we've been looked at, he gave them very clear instructions about what to do. We don't know if that happened here, or whether Nehemiah just came up with the plan himself. But he did come up with a plan to approach the king, to ask permission to go and rebuild the walls of the city. It was quite an audacious plan. And he actually was in a unique position. He was the right man in the right place at the right time. He was a cupbearer. Now that doesn't sound like a major role, but a cupbearer historically was an officer of high rank in the royal courts. His duty was to pour and serve the drinks at the royal table. But because of the constant fear of plots and intrigues such as poisoning, a person must have been regarded as thoroughly trustworthy to hold the position. He would guard against poisoning the king's cup, and was sometimes required to swallow some of the drink before serving it. And his confidential relationship with the king often gave him a position of great influence. The position of cupbearer has been greatly valued and given only to a select few throughout history. Qualifications for the job were not held lightly, but in high esteem. It was a position of great responsibility. So Nehemiah uses his position to approach King Artaxerxes. Bit of a risky adventure. He turned up that day looking sad, which was not allowed. He could have been punished, he could have been killed. But God is in this, and Nehemiah gets the opportunity to explain the problem to the king. Again, this too was a risk. He could have been seen as criticising the king and his rule over Israel. But Nehemiah not only gets permission to go and rebuild the walls, he gets supplies, letters of authority, even an armed guard as well. Clearly it was God's calling to Nehemiah to rebuild the wall. We don't know how God spoke to him, if he did speak to him directly, or whether it was just prompting and guiding his thoughts. Perhaps in some ways that feels more like our own experience. Perhaps more than some of the other callings that we've looked at. I'm not sure about you, but I don't know whether many of us have been visited by angels and given quite clear instructions of what to do. But I also love this because it was a call to a very practical task. A call to go and rebuild the wall. Not a very spiritual calling at first sight, just a building project. Yet the security of Jerusalem was important to the nation of Israel. And also being able to worship in safety in the rebuilt temple really mattered. So there was indeed very much a spiritual dimension to it as well. So the rest of the story in brief, Nehemiah and the people start to build the wall, but they face ridicule and opposition from those who live now near Jerusalem. They're threatened with attack, but Nehemiah shows great tactical leadership by not only organising the building, but also organising the defence of the walls. So despite everything, the walls are rebuilt and the gates rehung. But Nehemiah does more than just rebuilding the walls. He sorts out the provision of food for the poor who are being neglected. Along with Ezra, he teaches the people and leads them into a new commitment to God. They re-establish the temple worship as it should be. We also see him challenging the people and officials about corruption and greed and failing to observe the Sabbath. He succeeds in his task to build the walls that God has called him to. So what do we take from this? Nehemiah's call from God was a call to his heart. He saw a need that touched his heart deeply, a need which prompted him to take action. And God was clearly in this. Nehemiah not only succeeded in, but exceeded his task of rebuilding the wall. Nehemiah's response was a heart response to a situation, and what God seemed to be calling him to. We also see that he was clearly well fitted to the task. Again, perhaps not obvious at first, given the role he had before this. But we see the abilities he did have, his leadership and administration. Also his characteristics, his boldness and courage and perseverance. But above all, his commitment to prayer. Nehemiah's default response was to pray. He didn't just do things in his own strength and wisdom, he sought God's help. He asked God and listened to what he was saying. He brought him into all of his life and all the situations he faced. As I said, Nehemiah was well fitted to the job. He was the right shape. As we think about our calling, we too can think about our own shape. What are we best fitted to? That word shape we can use in evaluating what we feel God may be calling us to. But equally, just as we explore different things we might do in the church and in our everyday lives, exploring our shape, S-H-A-P-E, our spiritual gifts, our heart, our abilities, our personality, and our experience. Taken together, they spell out the word shape. It's what makes us what we are. It's our shape. And that in turn can help us see where and in what ways God can best use us. And notice that heart is in there. Perhaps more than we sometimes think, God does call to our hearts. He stirs something in us to respond to a particular need, or sows an idea in us. What about this, Dave? Or what about that? For me in my teens, it was a call to teaching and preaching. I didn't get a word from God as such, but just a sense of that this was something that I'd like to do, as well as something that I saw a need for. I didn't see the fulfilment of that until after university and a few years here in Warfield. But God had planted something in my heart that never went away. And during the times of waiting, I did get a word from God, with the words, "Feed my sheep," that somebody in our life group at the time shared. That led me to becoming an LLM, to training for preaching and teaching. And God affirmed within me that desire to see others grow as disciples. To take another example, Philippa, my daughter, she's got a heart to work with those in need and to make a difference. She did an internship with the church after she finished at university, working in the prison. Then she went on to work for the charity who ran the project in the prison. Then she did a master's degree in criminology and criminal justice, as you do. Then she amazingly got a job both working for the police commission in Durham, but also again with the police commission in York when they moved. And now she's working in a charity, changing lives, that help people turn their lives around, whether it's from homelessness, addiction, unemployment, or other difficulties that they're facing, perhaps many as a result of being in prison. God sowed something in her heart that has worked out through her job. Our calling is not just to stuff in the church, it might be to stuff in our work as well. A word of caution when we talk about God's calling to our heart. These days you will hear lots of people say, just follow your heart. But when I talk about God calling to our heart, I'm not talking about that. Often when people say that, they mean just do what seems right to you. But if we're talking about God's calling, there's a need for discernment and guidance. Praying and seeking God's confirmation. Praying and talking with other people. Testing the call. But let's think a little bit more about that word shape. First, our spiritual gifts. Those specific and enabling by God that He's put in our lives. Some more obviously supernatural, like the gifts of healing or miracles. Things that just seem perhaps just like our abilities, like administration, or our character, encouragement. But gifts that God has planted within us by His Spirit. We may know what those gifts are, but perhaps we don't. Sometimes we only discover our gifts when we actually do something that needs us to exercise those gifts. Then we have our heart, which we've already looked at quite a lot. That desire, that response that God puts in our hearts. Something we want to do, or maybe a particular area we have a heart for. Perhaps sometimes we also talk about our passion. Where is our passion for? And note that God does call us to do things that we want to do. We sometimes think perhaps that He only calls us into difficult things or things that we're not sure whether we do want to do. But God calls us into things that resonate with our heart, with what we want to do. Don't think that always it has to be a clear revelation from Him. Sometimes He may just put a desire in our heart to do something that is just right for who we are. So we have our spiritual gifts, we have our heart, and we also have our abilities. Those things that we're good at. Skills we've acquired, training and equipping that we've had over the years. Some that come naturally, but others that we have to work on and get better at through training and practice. And then there's our personality. What are we like? Are we an introvert or an extrovert? A practical person or more of a thinker? A people person? This will affect what our role might be. Are we an upfront person? Or maybe somebody who works in the background, for example. And finally there is our experience. What experience have we got from our past? It might have been experience directly relevant to what God is calling us to. Or it might have been experience in a similar area. But all those things together make up our shape. But let's apply that then for a moment to Nathan. To Nathan? To Nehemiah even. Well, what about his spiritual gift? Well, definitely I think he had the spiritual gift of leadership. His leadership was more than just secular leadership. He was also an encourager and an administrator. Gifts perhaps from God. Did he know he had these gifts before he responded to God's call? We don't know. He certainly had a heart for it. We've already looked at that. He had a heart for the work, but he also had a heart for the people. Sometimes God puts in our hearts, as he did with Nehemiah, what's on his heart, what he wants to deal with. He breaks our heart for what breaks his, as David Brown was talking about a few weeks ago. And what about Nehemiah's abilities? Well, did he have a leadership in his role as cupbearer? I'm not sure. But I'm sure he had to organise others and look after others. And what about his personality? Well, he certainly had boldness. He certainly was a people person. Practical. An extrovert perhaps? Certainly passionate. Did he have experience of building walls? Probably not. Did he have experience of organising people and tasks? Very probably. Did he have experience of dealing with political intrigues and opposition? Absolutely. So his shape did fit the task that God was calling to. What about me and my shape as it related to God calling me into teaching and preaching? I believe that God has given me the spiritual gift of teaching. But I didn't know that at the time when I started exploring that. It's only after I tried it that I found that that was true. Definitely God gave me a heart for that. Very much over the years that desire to see people grow as Christians has been reinforced again and again, to make disciples, to feed his sheep. What about my abilities? Well, certainly in university and in my early married life, I certainly did plenty of reading of Christian books and studying, and gained a reasonably good theological and biblical understanding that was important to preaching and teaching. But that was enhanced through my training as an LLM. What about my personality? Well, I'm very much an introvert, very much a thinker, and not so much a people person. But that's actually not a detriment to standing up in front and preaching. Actually, that's a positive aspect, I think, of standing up and preaching. As I said, I didn't have any much experience of preaching before I started. I'd done a couple of talks when the youth led the service, when we were leading the youth group. But not a lot of experience before I started exploring it. So that was my shape. What is your shape? Hopefully, as we've walked through this series, God has been speaking to us, perhaps affirming the role that he's already called us to, but maybe calling us to something new. So where do we go from here? Well, let's all be open to God's calling. Maybe you can start that by signing up for the Discover course in March, an opportunity to explore your shape further. But if God has been, or God does speak to you, follow up on that calling. Maybe try things out. There's no harm in trying something, even if that proves to not be the right place, and maybe God is calling you to something else. If it's a big thing that requires a major change to your life, then maybe you do need to take a little bit longer to think about it and pray about it and discern whether it is right. But some things, just give it a go, just try it out. We wanted to give those of you who are watching this video later an opportunity to respond in the same way as those who were in church this morning. As part of our response to this series, God is Calling, we want to offer ourselves anew to Him. I'm going to use a prayer called the Methodist Covenant Prayer. The Methodist Church has an annual covenant service each year. It's an opportunity to look back on the previous year, to thank God for all that He's done, but also an opportunity to commit themselves anew to God's service, to offer themselves to Him in service to Him. So as we come to the end of this series, God is Calling, part of our response might be to offer ourselves anew to Him. You might want to use this prayer as part of your response. It is a very challenging prayer, but a prayer of committing ourselves and offering ourselves to Him. You may not feel that you can pray all the words of the prayer, but pray what you can and offer yourself in whatever way you can. Take a moment to read through the words, then maybe rewind and pray along with the words. I am no longer my own, but yours. Put me to what you will, rank me with whom you will. Put me to doing, put me to suffering. Let me be employed for you or laid aside for you, exalted for you or brought low for you. Let me be full, let me be empty. Let me have all things, let me have nothing. I freely and wholeheartedly yield all things to your pleasure and disposal. And now, glorious and blessed God, Father, Son and Holy Spirit, you are mine and I am yours. So be it. And the covenant now made on earth, let it be ratified in heaven. Amen. As God continues to call us, so may we continue to respond to Him in whatever way and to whatever God is calling us to.